Good evening, and thank you for joining us for another Northshire Presents virtual event. I'm Rachel Person, Director of Events for Northshire Bookstore, with store locations in Saratoga Springs, New York, and Manchester Center, Vermont. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And before we get started, a few quick notes. First of all, thank you for your incredible loyalty and support of independent bookselling. We couldn't do events like this without the support of customers like you, so thank you for that so much. You can find tonight's event book at northshire.com, as well as a list of other upcoming Northshire events. And please use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you have this evening. Those are the logistical notes. I'm so pleased that I get to introduce Andy Karr this evening as he joins us to discuss his book, Into the Mirror, A Buddhist Journey Through Mind, Matter, and the Nature of Reality. He is a teacher, author, and photographer who offers profound and penetrating insights into Dharma and mind. He trained in the San Francisco Zen Center and co-founded the first Shambhala Center in France and taught regularly in Paris and other European Dharma centers for 10 years. He's the author of Into the Mirror and Contemplating Reality and the co-author of The Practice of Contemplative Photography. He mainly teaches the Mahayana view and meditation in Mahamudra. He will be interviewed this evening by writer, editor, and meditation teacher Barry Boyce, who is the founding editor of Mindful Magazine and mindful.org. He is the editor of and a primary contributor to the book, The Mindfulness Revolution, leading psychologists, scientists, artists, and meditation teachers on the power of mindfulness in daily life, and is also co-author of The Rules of Victory, a commentary on the strategic principles that underlie Sun Tzu's Art of War. Please join me in welcoming them to our screens this evening.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everybody who is joining us live and also after the fact on YouTube. Good evening, Andy. How are you?
I'm great, Barry, and I'm grateful to Northshire Books to have us here, and I'm delighted to have a chance to chat with you about stuff that we have chatted about before privately. So it's nice to be able to share this with other people.
So how long did you work on this latest book of yours, Into the Mirror?
Well, I think you and I first talked about it about a decade ago. And at that time, it wasn't really well formed what the book would be. In fact, I had a couple of false starts on it. But I think I've worked seriously on it for about 4 or 5 years.
So I'm going to ask you in a minute what the title Into the Mirror means. But before that, tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write the book. You know, writing a book is a big undertaking, so one needs a strong motivation. So what inspired you to write Into the Mirror?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that were particularly important for me. One is that I have felt that Buddhism has had a difficult time encountering the modern world. Sometimes, you know, it's been very well received and very passionate. People join in with it, but there's a certain element of Buddhism that's almost outside of the pale, beyond the pale, that seems mystical and weird to people. And I think that's because we haven't found ways of addressing some of the core resistances that are deeply embedded in our culture.
So yeah, that makes sense. So what is Into the Mirror mean? What's it about? If somebody was walking into the bookstore and says, okay, what the hell is this book about? So
yeah, my elevator speech for this book is that it's about how we can make a profound, transformative journey, a spiritual journey in an age of materialism.
And why? What does Into the Mirror describe about this shift you're talking about?
The image originally came to me as I don't know why, but it I liked it because it reminded me of Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. So that was the first inspiration, that it represented some real shift in perspective. But then later on, as I thought about it, it had another meaning that is a little different from Through the Looking Glass. It's about how so much of our lives is spent either chasing or running away from reflections, not really from things themselves, but our own projections of those things. And that the way to get out of this trap of the funhouse is to go into the mirror itself, go into the mind, which is the source of these reflections. So that's the transformation that the title represents.
So we're talking about examining the mind that perceives the world.
Perceives and fabricates, because the mind is generating continually all these mental images, these mental models of these projections of what we're experiencing. So we're looking, you and I at the moment are looking at computer screens, but we think we're seeing other people. And so there's a certain element of fabrication involved in that perception. And, you know, it's not wrong in a sense, but it's not right either. It's more like looking at a reflection and thinking that there's something there that's being reflected, not just relating to the reflection itself.
Well, to say that you and I are looking at computers and we think we're seeing people, and you know, that's a kind of a philosophical statement, but it seems somewhat harmless. How do we get ourselves into trouble with our projections?
Well, I think, you know, it is a philosophical statement. It's a view. It's an understanding of what's going on. But what is more important than the philosophical point is that experientially, we can start to see how these fabrications develop and proliferate. So in our everyday lives, there are all sorts of situations that are seemingly solid, real, and exactly the way we think they are. But in fact, those situations might be much more open and spacious than we experience them, because we don't recognize how much we're bringing to the table, how much we're bringing in terms of our own fabrications to the situations. So you might meet up with someone who you don't like, who you regard as an enemy, and that's a very fraught situation. A lot of emotionality will come up for you. A lot of projections about the other person will come up. You might take certain actions toward that person because of these feelings. And we don't have much freedom in that situation. We're driven by the projections, by the reflections. And if we can learn to recognize them, we learn that we can look much more directly and more precisely at the other and react perhaps more appropriately and directly, and not be driven by all this mental stuff that's going on.
So, in addition, this book is also in part a critique of materialism. And first off, how do you define materialism, and elaborate a bit on why it's such a problem.
So I think there's two aspects to the definition of materialism. One is it's a belief about the nature of reality. It's a belief that everything that we encounter, everything that exists, is what is described by physics. What it's made of particles, it's made of forces, and anything other than that doesn't exist. So mind, which is not obviously made of particles or matter, is excluded from the nature of reality by materialism. The other aspect of materialism is the belief that goes along with that, or the instinct that goes along with that, which is that the source of happiness is possessing stuff, things, material. And sometimes it's psychological material or spiritual material even, but this notion that you can possess stuff that is the basis of happiness, and that there's other stuff you need to avoid because that's the basis of unhappiness. That's the other aspect of materialism.
So you, Into the Mirror introduces us to Mahayana Buddhism and the fact that it has both a practical side and a what you might call a philosophical side, a side about view. How is it that Mahayana Buddhism traditionally and still to this day addresses this problem of materialism?
In particular, the Mahayana is very concerned about fabrication and how we mistake our experience for what it is not. It provides tools, both tools to deconstruct that confusion and tools to understand how things actually are. It's a very, I want to say sophisticated, but it's not so sophisticated. It's more blunt and, the deconstruction that takes place in the Mahayana really does help you pull apart the glue that makes our reality so stuck.
So in terms of the practical side, as everybody pretty much understands, Buddhism has a lot to do with meditating, or some form of meditation practice. Where does the meditation stuff come in relation to this deconstructing of our capacity to make things up, as it were, to fabricate?
Yeah. So we talk about three different levels of this practice, that there's an initial level of study, understanding, basic research into how to understand our experience. That's pretty much on the philosophical level. And then out of that, there's contemplation, which is where you apply the things that you are learning to your own experience and see if they hold true. It's a way of examining your own experience with the teachings as a lens, so that you develop some sort of confidence that this is actually speaking to you and it's not just some didactic thing that someone's telling you. And then from that, the key next step is to put that experience into meditation, so that the meditation is the real proving ground where you examine very precisely the nature of what is happening in your mind, in your experience, and you get to see how this fabrication takes place, how the projections take place, how your emotionality arises in terms of the things you're thinking about.
So there are many books that present in quite a bit of detail the Mahayana tradition of examining the nature of our mind and how we fabricate reality and materialism. If I can say, I think one of the strengths of Into the Mirror is that it introduces one to those methods and that approach in a plain language way that's pretty straightforward to follow and in modern language. So someone picking up the book will get that kind of primer on what the Mahayana philosophical and contemplative approach is. But you also decided to examine a number of ways that Western philosophy and science have explored the same topic area. And why did you choose to do that? And what's the benefit to the reader of that?
Well, I think that goes back to my initial inspiration of how Buddhism can meet the modern world in a sophisticated, straight up kind of way, that rather than using just our traditional language and traditional imagery and so on, which sometimes seems quite out of place, we can pick up on how contemporary thinkers are examining these issues and show that there's a lot of good correspondence between their insights and the insights that the Buddha, Nagarjuna, Asanga, and people who live 2,500 years or 2,000 years or 1,500 years ago had. That, that I think really at the core of Mahayana Buddhism is this very profound transformation that comes from recognizing that the mind is all that we can experience ultimately. That we think, we have all these models of an external world that come from science, but we experience them as mental models. And we have all these theories about reality that come from culture, that come from science, that come from all sorts of different things. But if we don't recognize that they are always part of our mental landscape and not part of the furniture of reality bound by them, we're stuck in living in a reality that doesn't have a lot of openness and flexibility and spaciousness.
So are you suggesting that these theories of reality that underpin science and our scientific worldview have day-to-day effects on this materialistic trap you say that we're caught in?
Yeah, I think they do. I think they help solidify our notions of, I am a product of my brain. When I see someone as a friend, it's because they're really a friend. When I see someone as an enemy, they're really an enemy. If I see a situation as good and attractive and I go toward it, it's because it really is good and attractive. And we fail to see all the background or underground or projected reality that's underneath all that. And we're, again, it's really about bondage and liberation. And the bondage comes from not seeing things as they actually are. And the liberation comes from recognizing how they are. So I think, getting back to the Western philosophy, I think I've been talking around it rather than answering the question. But there are a number of Western philosophers who have really challenged this materialist view that that everything is matter, that mind is an artifact or an illusion or an epiphenomena, whatever that means. So I think these people and their arguments can be real allies to Buddhists who are trying to introduce a notion of a more spacious reality.
Well, right off the bat in the section where you're dealing with the Western philosophical views, you talk about this thing called the hard problem, which I think relates to what you were just talking about. Can you say a little bit about what this thing called the hard problem is?
Yeah, it's essentially the classical mind-body problem. How does the mind arise from the body? That's kind of the classical way of viewing it. That's a basically materialist idea that the body matter is primary and the mind arises from it. So in the mid-1990s, an Australian philosopher named David Chalmers made a presentation of what he called the hard problem versus the easy problems. And there's a bit of irony in the easy problem part, because he says that, these are easy problems that the standard methods of Western science should be able to solve these in the next 100 or 200 years. So that's easy. But the more fundamental problem is, why is there experience? Why is there subjectivity? How can we explain that there could be such a thing? And eventually he came to the conclusion that consciousness, or mind, as we would say in Buddhism, must be a fundamental aspect of reality. Now, he didn't go all the way and say that's the only aspect of reality that we could experience, but he gets fairly close. And so the hard problem is referring to this basic issue of there must be mind. It's the most obvious thing to anyone who looks at their own experience. And there are a bunch of philosophical arguments you can make to demonstrate fairly powerfully that this is the case. So he's come up against a lot of resistance in the Western philosophical world, but I think by and large today, at least a large portion of scientists and philosophers acknowledge that there is a hard problem.
What is an example of the easy problem that'll be solved in a couple of 100 years?
The correlates, the neural correlates of various mental states.
Right. So figuring out when I get a particular feeling or smell something, what's happening in the brain, being actually able to map that. But
That's
even
right.
when you're done mapping that, Chalmers suggests, you're still not going to find the mind, even
There's,
though what you
yeah,
just said, the mind is undeniable.
there's an unbridgeable gap there. At least nobody in Western philosophy, and certainly no Buddhists, have come up with a way of bridging that gap that is broadly accepted. It's called the explanatory gap.
So these are generally the kinds of discussions that happen in specialist publications. You've decided to, in short, plain language chapters, summarize a variety of these different views. Um, why should we care about philosophy? I mean, isn't it generally just mental gymnastics, so to speak, best left to people who are gazing at their navel in the academy?
Yeah, well, I think often that's the case, but sometimes philosophical issues have deep personal significance. And I think that is the case here, that when there are philosophers, scientists, and everyday language, everyday culture has started to, a dominant theme in modern culture, science, and philosophy has been materialism. That what really matters is the brain, what really matters is physical stuff, and anything else, it's all in your head. And yet, what's happening, quote, all in your head, quote, seems to be the real sources of our happiness and misery. So unless we are prepared to really do a deep dive on our own experience and break through this blockage of materialism, I think we're kind of stuck.
So if we're stuck in a worldview, a materialistic worldview that is bolstered by science, that causes us to reinforce the world as about stuff.
I think that's well put, yes.
So we end up thinking that happiness is going to come from some kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
More money, more experiences, more
degrees, more prestige, more fame.
So it is bolstered, you say, by a scientific worldview. Is there a problem with science and technology in your view then? Is this a critique of science and technology?
Not at all. I have tremendous respect for science and how it has positively impacted our experience. The example that I like to use is that in the last 100 years, human lifespan has doubled. At the turn of the 20th century, people lived an average of 40 years. Today, people live an average of 80 years. And that's true not just in the developed world, but it's true all over the world. That human lifespan, and that's huge, that's amazing. Science has given us a second life. And that's fantastic. Do we use it wisely? That's another question. But no, science has done many wonderful things, and it's incredibly powerful. And I think, the challenge for us as modern people is to appreciate where science is beneficial and understand where it's not and deal with that. So, we're inventing fantastic medical procedures, and we're inventing AI that some people think might wipe out the human race. So, how I think this is going to come back to how we appreciate what is important in life. And if we're stuck on materialism, both the consumerist version and the belief that, my happiness depends on chemicals in my brain, it probably won't work out very well.
So the latter part of your book, the third part, if the beginning introduces us to Buddhism generally, and the middle part explores some of these philosophical worldviews in relation to how Buddhism deals with worldviews. In the end of the book, we learn more about Mahayana, and you were talking about, our lifespan has doubled, and how are we using that additional time, and, what's important in life. So what does Mahayana have to say about what's important in life, and why is this message, as you view it, timely? In particular, there are lots of views and practices that one can engage in. What do you particularly appreciate about Mahayana, and why, in your view, is it not just something, okay, this was concocted a couple of thousand years ago in India with people living under completely different conditions? How could that possibly be applicable and more than that, timely?
Well, I think for me, and from my own experience, the Mahayana offers a transformative journey that we can take, that each of us can practice, can learn, can use to go into the mirror, to transform the way we experience our world, experience our reality. And through that, develop compassion and wisdom. That seems like a pretty good deal for me.
So your last chapter, chapter 25, I'm just looking at, it's called The End. And it seems to be about death, ironically. So why did you choose to end at death, and what happens when we die, and how does that relate to materialism and all this other, and our, how to live well and benefit?
Yeah. Well, death is always lurking, isn't it?
Yes.
So I chose to include that because that is a big motivator for myself and for other Buddhists, the fact that we will have
well, not to say human beings generally, I think.
Well, yeah, it is. But particularly motivating people who are practicing this path to exert some vigor in doing that. And I think this is where the materialist view in particular is problematic. The materialist view of death is, that's it. Everything stops. No more issues. Because life depends on the body. So this is a claim. It's a metaphysical claim with no backing, since no scientist is able to observe the mind. No scientist is able to prove that the mind ceases. I can't prove to anyone that the mind continues, although it is certainly argued by the Buddhist tradition, and I have faith in that tradition, but I cannot prove that the mind continues. No scientist can prove that it doesn't. So this issue of what happens when we die is one that is really speculative for both science and Buddhism. And because of that, it's probably better to keep an open mind about it.
Well, maybe there's something akin to a Buddhist version of Pascal's wager that.
Yeah, that's right.
If there's the possibility that mind continues, perhaps I may be better off assuming that rather than assuming there's nothing after death.
That's great. Thank you. I like that, Barry.
Well, so maybe I'll write a book of Buddhism's Pascal's wager, or not. Speaking of books, before we see if there are any questions out there, I know that you've been inspired by books that are kicking around that you feel are adjacent to this exploration that one finds in Into the Mirror. What are some of those?
Well, I think one of the ones that I found really helpful in understanding the history of Mahayana, how it developed, is a book called The Golden Age of Indian Buddhist Philosophy by a man named Jan Westerhoff. Now, that's fairly scholarly stuff. Many people would not find that too easily digestible, but I love that book. Another book that I found really provocative and helpful on the science side of things was Carlo Rovelli's Helgoland, which is about the history of quantum physics, and in which Nagarjuna, the famous Buddhist philosopher, makes a surprise guest appearance toward the end. So that I found just he's a beautiful writer, and it's beautifully translated from the Italian, and it's super informative about quantum physics. So I highly recommend that one.
Well, it seems like there are some ways, quantum physics principles outline things that are so weird that confound our straight up materialistic way of viewing things, and it's coming out of straight science, that there seems to be some kind of meeting point between the philosophical investigations of an ancient Buddhist like Nagarjuna and how the materialistic worldview is crumbling in the hands of quantum physicists.
Yeah.
Well, Rachel, do we have any questions? Or if we don't, maybe we'll...
We do have a few audience questions. Also, audience members, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat or the Q&A box. But if you had more that you wanted to cover, I don't have a ton of audience questions, so you could keep going for another minute or two if you have more you wanted to get to.
No. Andy, okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I'm curious to hear what our viewers and listeners have to ask about first.
Okay.
or
The
declare.
first question that came in was from David, wanting to know, were there any Western philosophers who particularly influenced your thinking as you wrote this book?
Well, definitely David Chalmers. And, you know, I'm going to blank out on the names of pretty much everyone else. But yes, there were quite a few. And I'm just not going to remember anyone's name at the moment.
That's always the danger of being put on the spot. Nancy would like to know, how has your research and thinking as you worked on this book influenced your teaching practice?
I think the biggest influence has been, I'm a lot less sure of myself. And I've, you know, I'm much more open to other approaches and other points of view than I was when I began this project. You know, writing a book, you tend to think to yourself, you're doing it for other people. But I think the author of a book like this is the number one beneficiary. So I would say that I've learned a tremendous amount. You know, one of the things that happened for me as I was writing this was I felt when I started to talk about Mahayana Buddhism, that I wanted to talk about the history, how it developed. And I realized, even though I'd been studying this stuff for decades, I hadn't a clue. So I had to study it and learn it for myself. And I found a lot of things that surprised me. So, for example, one of the things that just seems to be a truism is that the Mahayana developed in opposition to early Buddhism, that it was sort of a revolutionary thing. But as I studied it, I found that, in fact, there were plenty of occasions where Mahayana monks and foundational vehicle monks were part of the same monastery or institution, that they all took the same vows. They had very similar worldviews. They had some different insights about things, but it was much more of an organic evolution than a revolution. And that was fantastic to learn. It was something about the humanity of the whole thing rather than some idealized sense of, oh, this tradition displaced that one. So I loved it.
That's fascinating. And I have to say, over the years I've been working with authors, it's so frequent that I hear an author talk about how the process of researching and writing a book changed them, that it's not just something that authors are putting out into the world. It is something that the process of creating is transformative in its own way.
Yeah, because if you knew it all to begin with, it probably wouldn't turn out to be a very interesting book.
Exactly. Susan would like to know if you have anything that you recommend, you know, specific practical steps to take to break through the roadblock of materialism.
Well, I think, you know, the specific thing that worked for me was studying some of this Western philosophy and then studying Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is kind of the ultimate explosive for deconstructing this.
Fascinating. That is the last audience question that I got in. So perhaps you'd like to sort of wrap us up with some closing thoughts, and then we can say good evening.
Okay.
Well, you know, one thing I want to add before these closing thoughts is that, you know, I can help Andy out here, since I have Into the Mirror in front of me, with a few of these philosophers who he relied on. There's a French philosopher, Michel Bitbol.
Yeah.
Bitbol.
Very.
Yeah.
Bitbol started out as a nuclear physicist and moved into philosophy and did some really, I think, extraordinary work on understanding the philosophy of science, understanding how measurement and concept replaced direct experience, that there was a gradual evolution in how we approach experiential things and replace them with measurements and theoretical constructs and mental models.
Yeah, for example, it's a great example in the book about how he talks about how we believe more in meteorology now than we do the weather we see outside of our door when we walk out. And anyway, to rattle off some other names briefly, Adam, for the person who asked, Adam Becker and Thomas Nagel, Evan Thompson, a lot of these folks are doing examinations of our modern worldviews and our scientific-based worldviews, and often from the point of view of advanced physics, where advanced physics is taking us. So
yeah, I'd like to also mention the Dalai Lama, because he has this great book called The Universe in a Single Atom, in which he talks very admiringly about modern science. He's been taken with modern science for his entire adult life, and yet he's able to critique its shortcomings. And there's a quote in my book from the Dalai Lama about metaphysical beliefs that many Western scientists hold that are purely metaphysical beliefs. And that was one of the things that really got me going on this.
So Andy, is there anything more you'd like to say by way of encouraging folks to pick up Into the Mirror and wrap up?
Well, I hope you found this conversation interesting, and maybe will provoke you to want to pick up the book. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm grateful, Rachel, for you hosting us, and Northshire Books for putting this on. I love independent bookstores. In an age where the behemoths, whom we won't mention, dominate so much of our culture, independent bookstores are great contributions to communities, to just having good culture. So thank you so much for that. And I want to thank Barry, my good friend, my longtime editor, my instigator and supporter, for doing this chat with me.
But also an objective, critical observer.
Yeah, and a mentor.
Anyway.
I would never have been able to publish my first book had Barry not taken me under his wing and very gently and precisely mentored me through the process. So that was amazing.
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to Northshire. It's great. I look forward to visiting both of your locations.
That would be wonderful. I would love to host you both in person someday. Thank you both so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight. This has been a lovely conversation. Audience, thank you for joining us. You can find Into the Mirror at northshire.com and sign up for other Northshire events there as well. Thank you so much and have a great night, everyone.
Bye-bye.